One of the strangest things about Bitcoin is that even intelligent people fear it deeply, not because they are unintelligent, but because Bitcoin challenges how people were taught to think about money, and psychologically, that creates resistance immediately, because most people grew up believing banks are stable, money is safe, and the system always works. But Bitcoin questions those assumptions, and emotionally, that feels uncomfortable, especially at first, because humans naturally resist ideas that challenge familiar systems, even smart people. That is why many intelligent investors dismissed Bitcoin early, not because they lacked information, but because psychologically, the idea felt irrational. Digital money, no government control, limited supply, and emotionally, those concepts sounded dangerous initially, especially during the early years. That is why fear around Bitcoin is often psychological first, not technical, because people fear uncertainty naturally, especially financially. That is why Bitcoin creates such strong emotional reactions. Some people become obsessed emotionally. Others reject it completely because Bitcoin forces people to rethink how money works, and psychologically, that creates tension, especially for people deeply attached to traditional financial systems, because emotionally, certainty feels safer, even if the system itself has problems. That is why many people ignore inflation emotionally for years, because inflation feels normal. Slowly losing purchasing power became psychologically accepted. But Bitcoin introduced a different idea: scarcity, an asset with a limited supply. And once people understand scarcity deeply, their perspective often changes. Not instantly, but gradually, because now they begin questioning things differently. Why does money lose value over time? Why does debt keep increasing globally? Why do financial systems require endless printing? And psychologically, those questions change perspective slowly. That is why many Bitcoin investors describe Bitcoin as more than an investment. For them, it becomes a shift in awareness, especially financially, because Bitcoin changes how people think about money, time, freedom, and ownership. That is why emotionally reactive people often struggle understanding Bitcoin initially, because emotionally, they focus only on price volatility. But long-term investors often focus more on the bigger picture: scarcity, adoption, long-term systems. That is a completely different mindset, especially psychologically, because emotionally reactive thinking usually focuses on short-term fear, but long-term thinking requires emotional patience. That is difficult for many people, especially today, where everything rewards instant reactions emotionally. That is why emotionally disciplined investors usually move differently. They think slower, they study deeper, and they avoid emotional conclusions immediately, because emotionally driven opinions often change constantly, but deep understanding creates stronger conviction over time. That is why many smart people eventually change their opinion about Bitcoin slowly, not because hype convinced them, but because understanding changed them psychologically. Remember, please, fear often disappears when understanding becomes deeper. And this is where Bitcoin becomes psychologically interesting, because once people move beyond fear, they begin seeing Bitcoin differently, not as a trend, not as hype, but as a completely different financial idea. And emotionally, that realization changes perspective slowly, because now people stop asking, "Can Bitcoin make me rich quickly?" and begin asking, What is money actually supposed to be? That is a much deeper question psychologically, especially today, because modern financial systems trained people to think short-term emotionally, consume now, borrow now, upgrade now. But Bitcoin encourages a different mindset, long-term thinking, patience, ownership, scarcity, and psychologically, those ideas feel unfamiliar to many people initially, especially in a world driven by endless consumption. That is why Bitcoin often attracts emotionally independent thinkers, people willing to question systems carefully, people willing to think differently, because emotionally dependent thinking usually follows the crowd automatically, but independent thinking requires emotional courage, especially financially, because questioning money means questioning power structures, and psychologically, that makes many people uncomfortable. That is why Bitcoin discussions often become emotional quickly, because money itself is deeply emotional psychologically. It represents security, freedom, status, survival, and when beliefs about money are challenged, people react emotionally. That is normal, especially during uncertainty. That is why emotionally disciplined investors usually focus more on learning than arguing emotionally online, because understanding matters more than ego, especially financially. That is why many long-term Bitcoin investors appear calmer emotionally over time, not because volatility disappears, but because conviction becomes stronger psychologically, and strong conviction reduces emotional panic, especially during market fear. That is why emotionally reactive investors often struggle during corrections, because emotionally, their belief depends only on price movement. But conviction built through understanding behaves differently psychologically, because now, fear no longer controls every decision emotionally. That is a powerful shift, especially in crypto, because crypto constantly tests emotions, fear, greed, impatience, doubt, and emotionally unstable investors usually react impulsively during those moments. But emotionally mature investors focus more on long-term systems, because systems reduce emotional chaos. That is why education matters so much, because knowledge creates clarity, and clarity reduces fear psychologically, especially over time. Remember, please, most people fear things. They never study deeply, learn carefully, think independently, and think long-term.